The debtor's guilt principle rests on the idea that if we feel indebted to someone, we're more likely to comply to his or her request because we feel as if we owe them. Usually this is good social etiquette, right? Your neighbor sees you struggling with your sofa as you're moving in and lends you a hand. A week later, when his car is in the shop, you don't hesitate to give him a ride to work. However, marketers take advantage of this tendency of human nature by intentionally inducing feelings of guilt in potential customers through a number of different techniques. We're going to explore 4 of these, beginning with the reciprocity technique. This technique relies on the social etiquette, again, that if someone does us a favor, we feel obligated to return it. This is generally good etiquette. However, the harm occurs when people are often tricked into returning a much larger favor. One of the best demos of the reciprocity technique was practiced years ago by a religious group called the Moonies, followers of Reverend Moon, sometimes referred to more casually as the Flower People. For a number of years before airport gates were screened for security, Mooney recruiters roamed the gates of airports, offering a free flower to people. Once people accepted the flower, the recruiter would ask for a minute of their time to talk about the religious cause. Of course, people would often find themselves captive audiences. They could not leave their gate and were unable to free themselves of the Mooney sales pitch until their plane boarded. Fortunately, this particular form of harassment is seldom found at airports, now that you must have a ticket to get to the gates. However, this technique is still often used in similar ways. Marketers use the reciprocity technique when they offer free samples like See's candy and Cinnabon do. Not all, but many people feel too uncomfortable walking out of the store without buying a product after accepting a free sample. In fact, retailers who use this technique often avoid neighborhoods where this social etiquette is not as common. For instance, like university neighborhoods, where student budgets often override polite social etiquette. Nonprofits are particularly notorious for giving tiny gifts in the mail, like address labels, then in that mailing asking for much larger charitable contributions in return. Many people are not comfortable keeping the free gift without donating, yet it is unlikely that anyone is going to go to the trouble and expense of returning the little gift. Thus, the nonprofits receive a great return on the minute cost of their little free gifts. The door-in-the-face technique also uses the debtor's principle, but in a slightly different way. In this case, a large, unreasonable request is first made, which of course is refused, but then a smaller, more reasonable request follows. Clients often feel badly about having to deny the first request, so are more likely to jump on the more reasonable one with compliance to alleviate their guilt. In another study by Bob Cialdini, which we will refer to as the Zoo Volunteer Study, this technique was demonstrated. Students were asked if they would be willing to spend 2 hours of volunteer work showing low-income kids through the zoo. A quarter of them agreed. The other half were initially asked to spend 2 years doing this volunteer work for free. And of course, almost everyone refused, but then were asked the same request as the other group, to donate the more reasonable 2 hours. In this case, over half of them agreed. Asking the unreasonable request first more than doubled compliance. By the way, consistent with the debtor's guilt principle, the effect of the prior unreasonable request was reduced significantly when a different person made the first and second requests, rather than the same person. Here's an interesting question. Which technique do you think works best? The foot in the door or the door in the face? Another group of social psychologists did a study that pitted these two techniques against each other, and they found that the answer depends on whether or not there is a significant delay. The door in the face technique wins when there is no or little delay. In other words, the initial and follow-up requests follow each other directly in time or within a couple of days apart. But apparently, the debtor's guilt, which is induced by the door in the face technique, fades by 3 days. The foot in the door technique wins when there is a delay of 3 days or more between requests. The multiple de-escalating request technique is a technique that is somewhat like using multiple doors in the face. Once requests are refused, they are followed by smaller and smaller requests until one is finally accepted. Marketers are actively seeking the client's highest bid. We don't tend to see this technique played out in as many contexts as we've witnessed the other techniques, but it is proven to be especially used and effective in the context of university fundraising. In this case, an initial request of $1,000 is made. If this is rejected, a request for $750 follows, then $500, and so on. This approach has been found to reliably yield higher donations than quantity-free requests, those without a suggested amount. That's what we mean by quantity-free requests. Interestingly, it also reliably yields higher donations than the most typical type of requests used in this context. And these are quantity-free requests along with statistics showing typical donation levels and ranges. In fact, research shows that approaches with statistics tend to turn people off, at least turn their brains off. People tend to ignore statistical info, meaning that it has no effect raising or lowering donations compared to quantity-free requests. 5 words more than double the compliance rate for door-to-door appeals in Cialdini's study for the American Cancer Society. These words were, "Even a penny would help." The even a penny technique involves making such an extremely small request that one would feel like a jerk to disagree. And in fact, once you decide that, of course you can donate a penny, well, you might as well make it worth the collector's time, someone who is working hard to solicit even penny donations. Don't you owe them that much? The debtor's principle at work. More interestingly, the median dollar contributions by individuals in this case were identical compared to the control condition where the 5 magic words were not used and no amount was suggested. So this technique doubled the number of people who donated without reducing the mean donation amount. Pretty powerful. Other variations of the 5 words are even $1 or even a minute of your time would help.